Today's Politics, Power and Resistance lecture is on the theme of gender and power. I acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal-Wangal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. As we'll learn, gender has been used to discipline and punish Indigenous peoples under colonialism, and that continues to this day. Today, I would like to pay my respects to the family of Yorta Yorta, Gunditj Mara, Jaja Wurrung and Wiradjuri woman, Veronica Nelson, whose death in custody is currently the subject of an inquest in Melbourne Coroner's Court. The lives of too many Black women are cut short. Women who are vital members of their families and communities are jailed for unpaid fines, shoplifting and other petty matters. In jail, they suffer abuse and neglect and frequently death. The inquest is revealing the many injustices meted out to Veronica by the police and the courts. The system is skewed against Indigenous women, children, and gender diverse peoples as well as men. Thinking about the relationship between colonialism, gender, and state power helps us to make sense of this, but it does not bring comfort or redress to the grieving families. So today there are a few issues that might raise of a sensitive nature to some students. There's nothing graphic shared, but I do welcome you to take a comfort break if you so need. So gender is above all a system of power and a site of political and social struggle. It's quite similar to race in that it's a powerful idea about how to organize the world, which has become difficult to disentangle from how we see ourselves. To understand this, we need to firstly explain where the idea of gender comes from. It's not natural, but rather is historically and socially constructed as a binary. There are different approaches to the study of gender, so guided by our guest interviewee, Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies Alison Phipps from Newcastle University in the UK, we'll be introduced to two key approaches, social reproduction theory and the coloniality of gender. As feminist writer Lola Olufemi writes, we often see the liberal state as the solution to gender inequality. However, the state is directly responsible for reproducing gendered oppression through laws and policies that negatively affect women and queer people, especially those who are poor. We're going to look at some of the ways the state produces gendered and sexual violence. Violence against women has exploded around the world. As the Marxist feminist Silvia Federici explains, we need to understand this violence in the context of the greater pressures on women to be responsible both for the domestic sphere and for working to fuel the economy. Women and gender diverse people often come under fire when the pressures of the modern capitalist system become overbearing, leading to them becoming the scapegoats. Despite the extent of gendered violence and domination, women and queer people, of course, are fighting back. So we're going to end with an example of social movements resisting gender oppression and state violence. So the first section of the lecture looks at gender as politics. The issue of gender has never not been political, but at present it appears as though conflicts about the rights of women and gender diverse people to freedom and equality are under grave threat. Issues such as reproductive rights and the freedom of transgender people to live without control and to have access to basic rights such as healthcare seem to be dangerously under threat. This comes at the same time as more and more people are questioning the idea of gender as a strict binary with roles and destinies for men and women. When we understand the link between gender and power, we can understand why asking these questions poses a threat to the social order. Today, rights that have been acquired by women and gender diverse people, though far from secure, are being dismantled. For example, in the US state of Oklahoma, the State House passed a bill criminalizing all abortions in April 2022. There are no exceptions for rape or incest. The governor is likely to sign the bill, meaning it will soon become law, and doctors could be imprisoned for up to 10 years for performing an abortion, and that's similar to legislation that already exists in Texas. So in 1973, the US Supreme Court overturned abortion bans which were in operation across many US states with the Supreme Court ruling Roe versus Wade that you've possibly heard about. Now, there's a risk today that that ruling could be overruled, meaning that many states, which are the orange ones on the map here, will move to ban abortion again. In January 2021, a near total ban on abortion was enforced in Poland. Meanwhile, although abortion was actually legalized in Argentina in 2020, after decades of protest, obstetricians and gynecologists are registering as conscientious objectors and refusing to grant them. And opponents of the right to choose are using the courts to try to block people from having abortions. At the same time, transgender children and their parents are under attack in US states such as Texas, where officials declared some gender reassignment therapies so-called child abuse under state law, and parents who allow them could lose custody of their children. So tragically, many families are currently attempting to relocate to other US states to avoid being criminalized. Meanwhile, there's an attempt to turn the issue of the tiny minority of transgender women in sports into a problem for the Australian federal election. Senator Claire Chandler has introduced a bill to restrict trans women playing in female sports called the Save Women's Sports Bill. The idea is people who are assigned female at birth shouldn't have to compete against transgender women. But in reality, this is already covered by existing legislation, and also there are actually very few transgender women in sports, and they don't necessarily have a physical advantage over other women. Success in sport is actually inherently based on having physical advantages, whatever your gender identity might be. Nevertheless, the issue is becoming a focal point for the election, potentially detracting from other more pressing concerns for all women, in particular violence and inequality. So these examples show how women and queer people's bodies are a political battleground. Understanding gender as political helps us think about it as an issue that goes much deeper than the question of personal identification. Seeing gender as a site of power that concerns us all, men, women, and non-binary people, and which reaches far beyond issues such as inequality between men and women, so things like the gender pay gap and women's representation, which are the typical ways in which gender is discussed, is the main message I want to get out today. All right, so how should we explain gender? What is it? It's important to understand that gender is what sociologists call a social construct. The gender theorist Judith Butler here describes the non-biological nature of gender roles. So gender is neither inevitable nor is it natural. It's in fact being constructed within a particular context, be that historical, geographical, cultural, or political. So although we might think that being a man and being a woman is defined by our biology, gender is in fact fluid. It's not determined by our biology, but it's actually a product of our environment, our performance, so how we wear our gender, how we move through the world, our choices, and the society in which we live. Our society sets gender up as a binary, so masculine on one hand and feminine on the other, but nothing is genetically inherent in men to make them more masculine or in women to make them feminine. There are global variations in behavior and expectations that show that gender is in fact a cultural idea. As Zulika Zevallos on her website The Other Sociologist explains, sex refers to the biological traits that societies use to assign people into the category of either male or female. Gender, on the other hand, is a concept that describes how societies determine and manage sex categories, the cultural meanings attached to men and women's roles, and how individuals understand their identities, including but not limited to being a man, woman, transgender, intersex, genderqueer, and other gender positions. Now, the important thing here is that sex and gender do not always align, but also researchers have questioned the idea that sex is fixed and gender is fluid from a purely chromosomal, in other words, from a biological perspective. In fact, neither sex nor gender are set in stone. While most people may feel comfortable with the gender they are assigned at birth, there is nothing that de facto links your external anatomy to your identity. So, for example, the picture here of a transgender father carrying his baby shows that both sex and gender are socially constructed. So above all, we need to understand gender as a system which is used to organize society through creating roles for people according to where they have been assigned within the gender hierarchy. Today, we accept that there are particular roles that are more suitable for men or for women, and we might fight for more women to be permitted to work in traditionally male jobs or to normalize men as carers or doing their share of the housework, but we should question what were the circumstances in which these roles came to be assigned to men or women, and what function dividing us according to gender served, especially after the growth of capitalism. Okay, so in this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about approaches to gender. Professor of Sociology and expert of gender and sexual violence, Alison Phipps, who is the author of the book Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism, gave an interview for our class. In the interview, she introduces two ways of thinking about gender, which help us to understand how gender evolved as a binary system, as I've been saying, built around this idea of there being two opposing genders, man and woman. As she explains, this system evolves under precise historical conditions, some of which we've already been learning about during the semester, capitalism and colonialism in particular. So what you can do is you can navigate to the first part of the interview, the 4-part interview Aranima and myself conducted with Alison, which is available on the website, in which she introduces these ideas. So one of the issues that Alison talks about is social reproduction. As she remarks, although gender has a longer history, capitalism brought about a change in approach to gender by separating between economic production on the one hand and reproduction on the other. The aim of reproduction simply becomes making future workers. Social reproduction refers to the sphere in which the functioning of capitalism is ensured. In other words, the home. It is in the home that the worker is not only born, but also is fed, clothed, and cared for so that he, traditionally, can go out to work. So social reproduction theories emphasize this unseen work that's done by women mainly, without which capitalist production would not function. The author Titi Bhattacharya explains that social reproduction asks the question, if workers produce commodities, who produces the worker? The answer is that it is unpaid women's work, which has supported the continuation of production. The necessity of this domestic labor for all other labor to take place is what triggered the organization of much second wave feminism, in other words, the feminism that was dominant in the 1960s and 1970s in the West, around the idea of the campaign for wages for housework, in order to show the extent to which capitalism is linked to and dependent upon unseen work. So in the 70s, many women in Western countries mobilized around this slogan, wages for housework. If so-called women's work, in other words, bringing up children, cleaning, cooking, and so on, was so vital for the capitalist machine, then it should be treated as work and women should be paid for it. Now, the aim, of course, was not really to monetize housework, but to point out the extent of the importance of social reproduction for capitalism by putting a dollar sign on it. How much is this worth? The Marxist feminist Silvia Federici said that in fact the campaign should better have been named Wages Against Housework. So Wages for Housework was founded by Selma James, and she's also the author of an important book which she brought out in 1975 called Sex, Race and Class. And in this book, she talks about the importance of thinking about sex, today we would say gender, in relation to race and class. And as Alison mentioned, these structures are always interrelated. Selma James writes that the feminist movement of the 70s learned about women and children's class position, so in other words, as unwaged and unvalued people, from the Black liberation movement. And so looking at where you are positioned in the social hierarchy in society and within the capitalist economy is really important for understanding how our social roles are connected to our capitalist function. So we're not just men or women. We are people who are related or are positioned in relation to these structures, to power, to capitalism, to the state, etc. So this blows apart the idea, as this quote shows, that we are destined by nature to do certain jobs, be it planting cane for enslaved Black people or changing nappies for women. But we should be really careful not to equate enslavement with being a woman in general, because of course white women were not subject to slavery and often owned slaves themselves. Furthermore, class is really important because not all women, of course, have to do domestic labour. Just as historically Indigenous and Black women served as maids and wet nurses, etc., to white women, so too today, middle and upper class women may have the opportunity to work, so to go out of the home to work, but that opportunity is based on working class and often Black and migrant women in particular, taking care of their children and their homes. And as Sarah Farris has shown in her study of what she calls femo-nationalism, which is the way feminism has been used to justify policies that police Muslim women in Europe in particular, Muslim women in that context have been encouraged to go out to work as a way, it is said, of liberating themselves from what white feminists see as an oppressive home life. However, often in reality, the only jobs that are available to them are domestic ones. So in order to receive state payments, they have to agree to go out to work looking after other people's children or cleaning their houses rather than having the time to look after their own families. Okay, so let's go a bit more in depth in the relationship between gender, race, class, and other positions. So both class and race are obviously really important in relation to gender. As the Black communist activist and scholar Angela Davis showed in her book, Women, Race and Class, it's really important to think about the role of Black women in the United States, which is where she was writing, as workers, going back to the days of slavery, and that this needs to be understood in terms of the division of labour between Black and white women, which continues to this day. So I've already spoken a little bit about the dependency of middle and upper class women on poor and negatively racialized women. So Angela Davis shows that both Black men and Black women's labour was exploited and continues to be to this day. That Black women held a different position in society to white women. So this is about the idea that we can't think of one global idea of being a woman. In fact, while white women were often barred from work, so they couldn't go out to work, and their main struggle was how to be included in the working force, how to be allowed to work, Black women, on the other hand, had no choice but to work. So they were always exploited. And so their struggle became, well, how do we get rid of this exploitation? So many people today use the term intersectionality to think about these things. So this relationship between the different axes of domination, gender, class, race, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. But the concept is usually attributed to the US legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, but it actually has much longer roots or deeper roots. And one important figure was the Trinidadian communist activist and writer Claudia Jones, who was active writing and being an activist in the mid-20th century. Claudia Jones is credited with the idea of triple oppression, and she argued that black women, as workers, as black people, and as women, were the most oppressed stratum in United States society. In other words, in the case of black women, class, race, and gender were all in play, and equal attention to all of these three levels of domination were important for having a fuller picture of what it would take for black women to be more free. Claudia Jones showed how black women had to work to make up for the fact that black men often had low wages or faced unemployment due to systemic racism, which was obviously something that white women didn't have to do. And when white women did enter the labour market, their wages were often significantly higher than those of black women, even though black women had been working all along. So what she calls the super exploitation of black women had a knock-on effect for the health and well-being of black children and the entire black family. So in 1977, a group of black socialist lesbian feminists met and drafted the Combahee River Statement. The statement came out of the activism of black women such as Claudia Jones, and it also placed the link between gender, race and class, but also sexuality, at the core of their analysis and activism. Each structure is responsible for shaping the next. They also spoke about the fact that there is no one way of being a woman or a single sisterhood, global sisterhood, which is the sort of language of the day. Rather, there are multiple ways of being women that are shaped by one's classed and raced position. And also, there is no essential way of being woman. There's no essence of womanhood. So from this perspective, transgender women are also women. Okay, so let's talk about the other concept that's dealt with in the first part of the interview with Alison Phipps. In other words, the coloniality of gender. Coloniality being a phrase we've already had quite a lot to do with in this course. So in week 3, we looked at the coloniality of power, an idea developed by the Peruvian thinker Aníbal Quijano. It's a way of thinking about global power over the last 500 years since 1492, and how what he calls coloniality continues to shape the world despite the official end of colonialism. You'll remember, hopefully, that I introduced this useful graphic by Nelson Maldonado Torres to show how the coloniality of power intersects with these two other dimensions, knowledge and being. Quijano writes that the imposition of the idea of the European family, or the structure of the European family, onto the majority of the world was crucial to the development of what he calls the modern colonial world system. So as this relates to the issue of reproduction, of course, we would assume that gender would be an important lens for the decolonial thinkers. Sadly, though, the mainly male decolonial thinkers have rather neglected gender, except in passing. But women such as the Argentinian scholar Maria Lugones, Sylvia Tamale from Uganda, and the Nigerian gender studies scholar Oyeronke Oyewumi, among many others, have played a vital role in looking at the role of gender in coloniality. So the late Argentinian philosopher Maria Lugones theorized gender itself as colonial. And she said that under colonization, Europeans imposed the gender binary system, an understanding of gender as having these two sides that we've been talking about, so male and female, which are opposed to each other in this binary. Before this, she argued, there was no understanding in non-European societies of binary gender because all kinds of genders existed. Normative European visions of what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman were then imposed onto Indigenous peoples along with the idea of the heterosexual couple unit. Because they didn't conform to these strict ideas about the gender divide that Europeans had, their humanity was put into question. Now, you'll remember that this connects to our discussion in week 3 about the coloniality of being. So you'll remember that the idea was that to be human in the European sense meant, to be also either a man or a woman. Lugonis explains that because Indigenous people didn't conform to these European gender roles, they were actually not seen as really human. And so colonized women were not seen as being women. So colonized people are then not only oppressed by colonization and racism, but they're also oppressed by the gender system, which forces them into gendered roles. Christianity, of course, played a big role in this by imposing highly gendered roles on people and turning Indigenous practices into sinful acts. Now, what this means in practice is that violence and mistreatment could be justified. For example, black women under slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean were seen only as vessels to reproduce the next generation of enslaved people. But as the historian Stella Dadzier writes in her book, A Kick in the Belly, on the everyday resistances of enslaved women, they always fought back. Nevertheless, violence against Indigenous women was used and continues to be used as a means of policing their improper gender behaviour. An Indigenous Chak woman from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh, Ucha Achak, writes about how women from her community in the 1970s were demeaned by men from the dominant Bengali culture for wearing traditional short skirts or for bathing naked in the river. Women responded by doubling the length of their skirts and then conforming to expectations of modest behaviour from dominant society. As Chak remarks, at this time the Bangladeshi nation was imposing what she calls heavy-handed nationalist agendas in the Chittagong Hill Tracts through various means, including transferring the population from the plains to the hills. And what this did was to bring together two very different groups with differing cultural expectations into confrontation with each other. So attacks on women and the use of gender as a way of power and control is always connected to other political agendas, in this case here, nationalism. So what we can already see is that not conforming to a particular way of doing gender is used as a means of power and control. And this is what Alison Phipps means when she talks about gender being a political device. So I would ask you to now navigate to the website and watch part 3 of the interview with Alison. In this part of the interview, she introduces the operations of sexual violence and its importance for maintaining gender norms. So thinking about why violence is necessary for imposing and keeping gender in check helps us to make sense of why gender as a social structure is above all, as we've been saying, about power and control. Now, in the interview, Alison mentions the work of Silvia Federici, whose analysis helps us to understand the origins of sexual violence and the significance of gender as a structure of power for installing and maintaining the capitalist system. Understanding this history helps us to challenge the idea of the gender binary as something that is natural and universal. In her book, Witches, Witch Hunting and Women, Silvia Federici expands on the argument of her classic book, Caliban and the Witch. The history of witch hunts in the Europe of the Middle Ages is a fundamental piece of the puzzle in understanding the development of early capitalism. The control of women and the regulation of gender then becomes crucial to the expansion of capitalism on a global scale through colonialism and imperialism. So this part of the puzzle is really important to add to the analysis we began all the way back in week 2 of the semester when we looked at capitalism. Federici argues that witch hunts serve to destroy what she calls a universe of female subjects and practices that stood in the way of the main requirements of the developing capitalist system. That is, the imposition of what she calls a constrained system of labor. So in other words, when people were no longer free to organize their own work for feeding themselves and their family, but began to have to work outside of the home in order to enrich others, basically, what we think of as being work under capitalism. By naming women as witches and persecuting them as dangerous and demonic, it was possible to strip women of their autonomy and to confine them to unpaid domestic work. In this way, the witch hunts are fundamental to the development of what we explained earlier as social reproduction. So Federici asks, how does one explain that for 3 centuries, thousands of women in Europe became the personification of the enemy within and of absolute evil? The women who were persecuted as witches were often midwives and healers, for example. They were frequently older women who didn't have families to protect them, and they were poor women who, stripped of the ability to earn a living using their old knowledges, were often forced to beg. So this slide, you may remember, is from my lecture in week 2. I mentioned the significance of the enclosure movement in England, which was between 1450 and 1640, during which common land, in other words, the land that could be used by all people for whatever purposes for free, was seized and fenced off and turned into private plots. Federici writes that it was in this context that witch hunts began. With enclosure, people saw rising prices and a loss of rights, which saw older women especially being left with nothing to live on. Until this point, for example, widows had the right to access food, wood and sustenance, but as early capitalism led to everything coming with a price, these rights of course were taken away. So needing to rely on begging, the women became effectively criminalized. So Federici remarks that a key reason that women were persecuted as so-called witches was because they fought back against their oppression. They were charged with being quarrelsome and stirring up trouble with neighbors, for example. And crucially also, and this links all the way back to what I spoke about at the beginning of the lecture with the curtailment of rights around the body and reproduction, women were also charged at this time with being sexually transgressive and as being involved in so-called lewd or promiscuous behavior. So women may have been healers or midwives or practitioners of magic. All of these ways of being posed a danger to the local and national power structure. So we can see that just as in the case of the Chak people in Bangladesh, the idea of immodest and sexual impropriety is a way to discipline and punish women. Silvia Federici's point is that the wider context for this, in other words, the development of capitalism, is the key piece. Women couldn't work autonomously outside the new capitalist system. They couldn't be allowed to make their own living as healers or midwives, nor could they expect to get anything for free. Their only role now was in the home, restricted to reproducing the future generation of workers and creating the domestic conditions necessary for the capitalist machine to grind on. So as Federici writes in chapter 6 of Witches, Witch Hunts and Women, violence against women didn't end with the witch hunts, but it actually continues to this day and has probably become worse. We tend to think about violence against women as interpersonal violence, and we use the phrase domestic violence, which implies that women mainly suffer violence within the home. Now, of course, the home is a major site for violence, but what we need to do is to understand the external structures that enable this violence. To a great extent, the state provides the framework for enabling violence against women to go on. And there are many reasons for this, including the existence of misogynistic, so in other words, anti-women laws and policies, which make it very difficult for women to seek justice when they are the victims of sexual violence, the imposition of the family structure as the only legitimate mode of social organization, and the punishment of single mothers in particular by the welfare system, which we looked at in weeks 6 and 7, is a key way in which the state participates in upholding the conditions of violence against women. But it's also important to understand that the state itself enacts violence against women and queer people. Now, one of the ways the state perpetuates violence is through the imposition of what are called carceral solutions. And we're going to look at this further in week 11. A carceral solution refers to the use of the legal system and ultimately of prisons as the only way to punish violence. Many feminists call for tougher sentences for men who perpetuate violence against women, but Indigenous women and black women in particular have warned against the use of prisons to solve the problem of violence. The reason for this is that prisons themselves are, of course, violent institutions. They perpetuate and embed violence rather than solving it. As the campaigning organisation Sisters Inside, which acts on behalf of incarcerated women, has written, calling the police can't be the only response to violence. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women will often not call the police when they face domestic violence because they often end up getting criminalised themselves. This was the case of Ms. Du. She was a 22-year-old Aboriginal woman from Western Australia. She died in police custody in 2013 after a doctor diagnosed her with so-called behavioural issues. Ms. Du had been originally arrested for unpaid fines, but she actually originally called the police because she'd been the victim of domestic violence. This led to an infection in her ribs, which was what she later died from because the police refused to treat her. As the Aboriginal journalist Amy McQuire writes, Aboriginal women are the fastest growing incarcerated group in Australia, and they are often too scared to report family violence because they get arrested or jailed despite being victims themselves. As a joint report by Sisters Inside and the Institute for Collaborative Race Research in Queensland notes, the tendency to turn to the state to redress gender and sexual violence is really problematic, especially when it comes to Indigenous women, because the state itself has always enacted and continues to enact violence against women in multiple ways. This includes incarceration, so taking people to jail, the taking of children, and the breaking up of Indigenous families. The police, the legal system, and the welfare system work together since early colonial times to police the Indigenous family. And the effect is to embed and reinforce violence rather than reducing it. And this is something we're going to be looking at in a lot more detail in weeks 11 and 12. Silvia Federici argues that violence against women across the world has grown in scale in recent years, in a context of greater and greater inequality that's been brought about by globalised capitalism. According to Federici, it's not at all surprising that violence against women, especially Afro-descendant and Indigenous women, is increasing in areas that are rich in natural resources, be it in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. This picture depicts Mura Indigenous people in a deforested area in Brazil, a process that's being accelerated by the policies of Brazil's right-wing leader, Jair Bolsonaro, who relatedly has also attacked the teaching of gender studies. For Federici, the violence against women in these areas is equivalent to what she calls the new enclosures. It serves in carrying out land grabs, privatizations and wars in regions that are rich in minerals and other resources by mining and petroleum companies. Federici details the extremity of the violence meted out to women, but she argues it would be wrong to see this as purely a matter of individual male brutality. Rather, this violence is enabled by the policies, both national and international, that allow for the domination by private companies who are determined to strip the earth of its natural resources for their enrichment at all costs. The bidding of these companies is often done by armies and militias. These acts of violence, as Federici writes, must be planned, calculated, and performed with the utmost guarantee of impunity, in the same way as mining companies today pollute lands, rivers, and streams with deadly chemicals with total impunity, while the people who live off these resources are imprisoned by security guards if they dare to resist. So meting out violence to women is a way to strike at the heart of a community's ability to resist. As Federici says, it sends a message because of, quote, what women represent in their capacity to keep their communities together and to defend non-commercial connections of security and wealth. And just as in the Middle Ages in Europe, witchcraft accusations today are rife in parts of Africa and India, especially in areas that have been designated for land privatization, such as the tribal areas of India. Unemployment and precarious work is another context for violence against women. Women are often at the brunt of male frustration due to poverty, for example. Federici writes about the prevalence of so-called dowry murders in India, where middle-class men kill their wives if they don't bring enough assets with them, she writes. Rape is another mechanism of control over women's bodies that has always been a key arm of war and colonization. So misogyny, this hatred of women, according to Federici, is often a response to women's greater economic autonomy and also the rise of feminist activism. This brings us to the question of how women are responding to gendered oppression and sexual violence. Now, we're going to focus on this in our tutorial discussions via Alison Phipps's interview, where she answers the question of how campaigners are resisting sexual violence. But for now, let's focus on one example mentioned by Alison in the interview, that of Sisters Uncut. So the background for this is that an off-duty police officer named Wayne Couzens murdered a woman called Sarah Everard in London in 2021. A protest was organised to speak out about the culture of police violence targeting women. At the protest itself, police silently attacked women who were protesting. Sisters Uncut called out the police response that Sarah Everard's killer had been what they called a bad apple or a lone monster. In a statement, they wrote that other police used the nickname the rapist for Wayne Couzens, the man who murdered Sarah, but they did nothing to stop him despite him sending, quote, vile, misogynistic, racist and homophobic messages to colleagues on WhatsApp. They said also that we know that even after Couzens pled guilty, colleagues attended court to provide positive character references for him. So the wider context for this is that in the UK, at least 15 women have been killed by police officers since 2009, and there have also been over 700 reports of domestic violence made against police officers between 2015 and 2018 alone. Similar to Sisters Inside here in Australia, Sisters Uncut has been leading the way in making the point that more policing doesn't solve the problem of violence against women, because police and policing as an institution perpetuates violence. It doesn't solve it. So it's important to end by noting that although much of my focus has been on violence against women, movements such as Sisters Uncut insist on their feminism being inclusive of all women, including transgender women. The movement protesting violence against women of campaigning groups such as Sisters Uncut recognizes that violence against women is produced because of the intrinsic violence of gender as a system of power and domination. The system of gender imposes strict roles onto us as either men or women, and it is on this basis that it perpetuates violence. So next week we'll be listening to a guest lecture by Dr. Lana Tatour from UNSW on activism led by queer people in Palestine. And in this context we'll be able to focus more on how homophobia and transphobia too are major axes of gender domination and violence, and how people are joining together to resist it. So in summary, we need to think about gender as a political device first and foremost. It's an economic, social and cultural structural binary, but it also refers to a spectrum of different identities. Social reproduction refers to the sphere of unpaid domestic labour needed to uphold capitalism, which is generally performed by women. We need also to think about the ways in which gender is colonially constructed, and pay attention to Black socialist feminism, such as that of Claudia Jones, who insist on looking at how sociologically women all over the world don't have the same life experiences as women. So there's no one way to be women. We need to think about race, class, sexuality, physical ability, and so on as linked to gender. Sexual and gender violence, as I've been saying, are a crucial arm of capitalist accumulation. It's in that context that they should be explored. And lastly, feminist movements are rising up to oppose state and carceral violence that affects women and gender diverse people. Thank you.